for being here with us today for another installment of the online conversations. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Zoe. Oh, for some reason, my mic just went muted for a second there. Okay, yes. So my name is Zoe Black. I am the legal and education officer at Gender Dynamics. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And so today's conversation is really going to orientate itself around the concept of inclusive feminist approach to trans exclusion. We do have two lovely people on our panel today, Bika Minga and Liberty Matesa. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today around your thoughts around inclusive feminism. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to quickly run through some of the house rules. Just please ensure that your mics are turned off when you're not speaking. There will be an opportunity after the panelists have had their little discussion for you to ask questions. So we really do encourage you to, you can use the raise hand function to ask your question, or feel free to please type that question in the chat. Like I said, that will happen towards the end of the session. And we recognize also that sometimes these conversations can be triggering for some people and a little bit difficult for some people. So if it is becoming a little bit too much, please do feel free to excuse yourself from the session. A podcast will be made available of the recording of this online conversation on the GDX website. So you can go back and revisit the conversation there again. Okay, I think I'm not going to talk too much. Just to talk very broadly here around the notion of feminism and introduction into the conversation, we recognize that feminism is a very much a multiform approach that recognizes the various facets of oppression and how those various aspects intersect with one another and how they impact specifically trans and gender diverse persons' ability to access basic things around human rights and around dignity. And lately we've seen, although this is not anything new, we've seen that there've been quite a number of anti-trans sentiments that's been expressed by political figures, by public figures, and that also has a very far-reaching and a very direct consequence on the trans and gender diverse community. And so really today we're trying to attempt to place trans and gender diverse experience at the center of that analysis in terms of how we see those intersecting oppressions of women and trans and gender diverse persons, and how that's to be understood in the context of inclusive feminism. Okay, I think I'm gonna hand over very shortly and introduce our panel members again, Bika Minga and Liberty Matesa. Thank you so much for being here with us again today. And I think I'm gonna give the floor over to B to share some of the initial thoughts and comments around inclusive feminism. B, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. I just want to apologize. I am somewhere in the middle of England using my computer outside a Starbucks at a petrol station, so I have no idea how well this is going to work. But thank you for inviting me to have this conversation, and I'm super excited to be in conversation with Liberty, someone I consider family, and I think these are important things to be talking about. I want to say that the conversation, this topic emerged from a paper I recently published in a collection called Turf Wars about Chimamande's kind of comments about who is and isn't women and what she thinks trans women are. And I think that this is an important conversation for us to have, both as the trans community, but more broadly, I have this conversation quite often with cis women and feminists, and sometimes with cis men when they're open to it. But I think, you know, feminism for me inherently includes us. It is based on the notion of gender equality, and for me that can only mean including all of us. There is a particular strand of feminism, a kind of popular strand of feminism, that I think in the global north we are seeing increasingly become the topic of conversation. And in a patriarchal world, that that strand of feminism works to become the kind of function. Just like in the 80s, there was a fear about feminists, you know, they were called the bra burners, even though bra burning never actually happened. It's a way to sell or present feminists to a mass audience in a way that's quite scary. And one of the ways that feminism is being weaponized now as something threatening is to use trans people as a threat to women and feminism. But at the baseline, I think that that's a very global northern issue. And it's my belief that in the global south, and particularly on the African continent, we've seen a different approach to feminism, a kind of feminism that wants to engage with trans people and is really interested in what trans and gender diverse people mean. Sure, there are some feminists who have a problem with this, but I think by and large, we've seen a far more inclusive approach to feminism. Liberty?
Thanks, B. From my end, good afternoon, everyone. I think that I share the sentiments with B around the notion of gender equality, and perhaps troubling that a bit in the sense that we're sitting at a moment where it's becoming also quite evident that in many instances, gender equality is negotiated on cis-normative terms as opposed to a more authentic and broader understanding as to include trans and gender diverse persons as a broad category of multiple forms of identities and expressions. I also want to say that this is a very important conversation, yet contentious conversation to have, but it is necessary because it is life-saving for us as trans and gender diverse persons. It has particular policy implications, the way in which laws are shaped based on the type of ideology that's playing itself out around the table, and of course how that is transferred to a social level in which we are understood by our communities, either through a lens of being able to protect our rights and our interests or exposing us to harm and violence. In being clear about the issue as well, that we are talking about a very particular school of feminism and not feminism broadly. I do think that as a feminist myself, I see the transformative potential that exists within feminism for us as trans and gender diverse persons. Of course, that cannot be at the expense of promoting, not at the expense of promoting, but at the instance of promoting a trans exclusionary radical type of feminism within the world. So when I think of feminism, or when I dream of feminism rather, I dream of a feminism where we as trans women are not judged for the particulars of our physical bodies. It's a feminism that does not question, object to, and invalidate our womanness based on narrow preconceived ideas of what our self-affirmation journeys should look like. I do dream of a feminism that can look beyond the body politics in shaping definitions of what it means to be a woman in a world that is so patriarchal. I dream of a feminism that reflects on what it takes to be a trans woman in the world, in such a violent world that tells us no consistently and constantly, that is hell-bent on invalidating our existence through the course of time. And I dream of a feminism that can actually be accountable for the type of hurt, insult, pain, humiliation, trauma that it has subjected a lot of trans women and gender diverse persons within feminist spaces. And I think for me that is really aspirational in nature. Drawing from my own experiences in having navigated women-only spaces, I have seen, and of course, coupled with feminist spaces, I've experienced the silencing power of feminism. I've experienced the policing power of feminism, where we are not able to talk about forming and shaping a more authentic, broader type of understanding of gender in the context of feminism, and of course, how narrow understandings and conceptualizations of womanness have been used to police our bodies. On the one end, we are not woman enough in being able to be in this space. On the other end, we are performing femininity or hyperfemininity, which according to some schools, particularly TERFs, disqualifies us from having any right in claiming our woman identities within these types of spaces. So I've experienced it as being very dismissive, very undermining of the very values and principles upon which feminism is based, which is self-determination, self-identification, bodily autonomy, and dignity. So I'm going to park it there. Be over to you.
I mean, yeah, Liberty, I hear you on that. I think that one of the key concerns I have with feminism is this consistent orientation towards a notion of womanhood rather than conceptualizing gender more broadly. You know, feminism for a long time has wanted to undo the gender hierarchy. One of the ways that I came to understand myself as a trans person, or to understand that I wasn't a woman, is a key feminist text, Simone de Beauvoir, saying one is not born a woman, one becomes one. And then I knew that I couldn't become a woman. And I think that there are ways in which we have to be careful as trans people. There is a way in which feminism is dominated by the idea of womanhood as the only way in which gender might happen, and then cis womanhood as the defining kind of the mountaintop of gender identity, and then everyone else is judged against that in terms of how they might be included in the structure of feminism. And I think that trans feminism in particular holds a challenge to that, in saying that, I mean, I certainly think there's space for, and I see Spoo's question, I certainly think there's space for trans men, trans masculine people, non-binary, gender diverse people, and trans women. Unfortunately, the kind of tussle at the moment, at least in a broader, more global northern sense, is this between this idea of what it means to be a woman. And I think in some sense we can kind of see, we can have some, and Liberty and I spoke about this earlier, we can have some sympathy for that position, that for so long, trans and gender diverse people have been fighting a particular battle that has caused them to live in a certain kind of invisibility. Women, cis women in particular, have been out on the front lines dealing with patriarchy in a particular way, and that has been defined around their bodies and their notions of womanhood. Enter trans people, and it's destabilizing, and the only people that are really having to deal with this destabilizing force are cis women. Cis men are still in the patriarchy, still enjoying the power. And you know, I don't agree with it. I have some sympathy for their panic about their political position. Unfortunately, I think what it does is that it doesn't see that, and I think we know this from whichever angle we come from, coalition building is the kind of politics we all dream of, that we build solidarity across lines, and the kind of one single strand feminism that only sees it as available to and defined around cis women and cis womanhood is exclusionary in that sense, and in itself is actually crippling. Sorry, I cut out there. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you now, B. Yes,
okay.
I think you're back.
Sorry. Yeah. Apologies. Yeah, so what I was saying is that there's a particular strand of feminist thinking, and I do think it's a very small strand, actually, that is just being picked up and taken as a kind of mainstream perception, when many of us, there are ways in which we experience feminist spaces as challenging. And I do think that there should be spaces for women only that exclude, and this again maybe is leaning towards Spoo's question, you know, if you're a trans man, you are identifying and living as a man in the world, then when there's a space is for women only, whether that's trans women or cis women, it's not for trans men, and trans men need to accept that. I often find that trans men feel that they want access to women's spaces when they are about feminism. And I do think that they can be separate women's spaces. Liberty.
Indeed, and earlier on today, I had a conversation with one of my, with a friend of mine that's from the Caribbean, and there was a session that was held over the weekend. I think it was entitled "From the Fringes," and it invited LBQ women into the space. And then, of course, what I found fascinating about the type of audience that it catered to, trans men were also included. So I was quite curious to know around what is the type of dynamic that's playing itself out in this particular instance where trans men are included into LBQ women's spaces. What is the conversation? What does it look like? And of course, how do you traverse that particular domain? And the direct question that I asked the person was trans women part of the conversation? And the person indicated, no, trans women were not. And so I didn't want to jump to any conclusions in terms of based on my own preconceived ideas around what I understand to be inclusive feminism. And I was just like taken aback in terms of what's happening in one other part of the world that enables trans men to be participating within women's only spaces, whereas trans women are excluded. And it's something that I want to perhaps delve into a little bit more. In looking at and drawing from that, the question that I then was left with in the active exclusion of trans women is that what is at stake for cisgender women within women's only spaces by excluding trans women? And again, this is something that I'm trying to wrap my head around. Is it a policy issue? Is it an issue around resources? Because that has come up on countless times where I've sat at meeting tables, and one point a woman indicated that trans organizations, particularly in the name of trans women, are hijacking funding that is destined for women's rights organizations. I'm like, that is quite interesting how in this particular instance, when we are saying on the one end, we recognize the diversities of womanness, that for purposes of raising funds, immediately there's a division that happens in the sense that cisgender woman qualifies at that time for funding specific to women's rights advancements in the world. And trans women are relegated to the space of otherness, that it's almost like your entire existence is invalidated by way of how you then understand the system to work in relation to granting of funds. And that sat very unwell with me to the point where I then asked the question, what is really at here when it comes to negotiating space and place, and of course opportunity? Do cisgender women see trans women within spaces as an active threat, as competition for opportunity and resources? And if so, as opposed to invalidating our existence in the spaces, that should not be the conversation. The conversation should be around then how do we engage in getting access to resources equitably, in getting access to recognition equitably as women, and not wholesale being deprived access to spaces by virtue of being a trans woman.
I think Liberty, for me, that's the key point there, is access to spaces as women, right? And what I see often, and I've seen this, I see it in local news as well, and I spoke to you about this a while ago, and Jabu and I have spoken about this, that there's a way in which cis to understand that there is this thing called being a woman or being a man or being non-binary, and there are journeys to those positions. Someone cis, we're saying that is an adjective which describes your journey to womanhood. Trans is just another adjective that describes the ways in which this other body reached womanhood, right? And cis women want to hold on to, or so people want to hold on to the idea that they are actually the defining idea of what it should be, and everyone else is striving to achieve that particular notion of existence. And I think what I see most often in the ways in which we are undermined in terms of women's and feminist movements is the ways in which unthinking me is the ways in which we write the words trans woman, trans men. If we write it trans space woman or trans space man, we're saying there's an adjective, it describes the journey of being a woman or a man. When we put the words together, it becomes very difficult. If we say trans woman, one word, it becomes very difficult to say trans woman or woman if we've already said trans woman is one word. And I see subtly in a lot of documents, you know, cis people will write cis-space woman, but they'll write trans woman as one word because it makes trans women an entirely different group of people. They're not women as part of the broad category of women. They're a particular alien species called the trans woman. And I think we haven't thought through the ways in which that subtlety of language and the subtlety of it in our own writing and in organizations that work with us undo the position of being a woman who just happens to be trans as valid as being a woman who just happens to be cis. Does that make sense?
Indeed, and I think for us, in order to look at what we spoke about earlier on, to get to a space of really understanding how we're going to navigate this very tricky terrain, we need to invest a lot of energy probably in terms of having more dialogues and conversations and trying to cultivate some sort of cross-movement building from the different spaces from which we advocate at this time in order to find some sort of common ground in how we push back as a collective and be able to educate one another through that process. And I think that is also a very tiring process in itself, having to educate someone else about the type of marginalization that you are experiencing on the one end, but also why it's necessary for you to be recognized within spaces as a woman. I think that becomes very, very challenging to hold on an individual and at the collective level when we speak from the perspective of being trans women stepping into those spaces. But we need to have those conversations and we need to ensure that we create enabling and safe spaces to have these conversations to push us forward, because ultimately this dabbling in creating of gendered hierarchies is going to lead us right into the trap of playing into the patriarchal game ultimately, which is again seeing how we can shift gendered identities with people, of course, a particular identity being the penultimate and then other identities being relegated to the most margins of society. And I think that would be a possible response to what we are also currently experiencing in order to just get to some sort of an understanding that turf politics is toxic at this time and we need to revision and reimagine new ways of building dignified and inclusive spaces for all women in all our diversities.
I think we've lost B again. B, are you here? No, it looks like B's left the session, I think.
Whilst we're waiting on B, Zoe, perhaps just one or two comments still from my end. Something as small as just appropriately gendering someone and using the correct pronouns and not people's dead names goes a long way in solidifying some sort of trust between differently located feminists within feminist spaces. If we're looking at how we also actively create spaces that are conducive for those dialogues, and of course conducive on the terms that it also needs to speak to conversations beyond the typical gender and sex binaries that we often exist in. We're looking at ways of addressing feminism through the lens of healing work, caring work, being accountable for the hurt that we cause in the spaces that we navigate, and ensuring that we don't use feminism as a weapon against gender minorities that is trying to establish some sort of space for dignity within these with these overarching spaces that's often created. The last point in looking at the implications for policy, I shrug to think when I think that turf politics might pick up momentum at this particular moment within our context in which that we navigate, and turfs are sitting at the policy decision-making table, and when it comes to a voting process, applying this particular ideological thinking to ensure that trans people, for the purposes of legal gender recognition, for example, are not recognized as women in the way in which we understand the system to be at the moment, but again relegated to the space of otherness and completely invalidating our right to even choice in that moment. So I start to think of the consequence and the ripple effect that this may have if we do not concretely address it in the work that we do on a day-to-day basis.
So Liberty, so that's interesting, because I was listening to yourself and B talking through a lot of these things, and so really when cisness is placed at, I guess, the center concept around how we define or how people are defining womanhood, and that has a very, very real impact on how policy, on how legislation, how certain decisions get made in higher up places that have a direct impact on the very lived reality of trans and gender diverse persons. And so I guess one of these questions that I keep asking other people, I keep asking myself is, how do we gain, I guess, traction in those spaces to, one, let's call it a change, what is that turf narrative in those decision-making spaces, and while, I guess, building these cross-movement initiatives.
And that is where those dialogues become so important in being able to shift us to a space of mutual understanding and also empathy for one another's experiences based on our different locations within the context of defining women, that we depend on solidarities to exist in order to feel like we can gain access to policy and decision-making spaces, strategic spaces. But if we are not at that table, we also depend on our allies, which we are hoping would be in the most regressive sense of our across the region, cisgender women that might also be sitting at that table, being able to advance our interests as a collective, not be able to be limited by a particular understanding of womanness that seeks to exert hegemony over the entire, over our collective understandings. So I think for me that would be a possibility in terms of, again, the change that we want to see at policy level really depends on the type of solidarities we form in being represented there, but also in being granted access to those spaces.
Sorry for disappearing, I'm back again.
Hi, V. It's good to have you back in the space. Yeah, we were broadly just talking around how the center of cisness has been placed in how we define womanhood, and that has a very much direct impact on policy and decision making.
Sure.
And so when we exclude, so when we talk about trans and gender diverse persons and trans women specifically being excluded from those spaces, it makes it very, very difficult to improve the quality of life and improve representation in those spaces. And so this really talks to, I guess, cross movement building.
Yeah, and
you
know, the need for solidarity is I think it's always a very strange thing, and I think we've seen this more and more recently with the language of you know, women with an X and non-binary, and that it seems almost more palatable to accept non-binary people in a lot of spaces and to say, oh, we include non-binary people, as though that is as far as kind of feminist understandings on gender diversity are going to go. And even when saying, oh, you know, we've heard it a lot, particularly I think across the African continent recently, with this idea that, you know, trans organizations are sucking up all the funding, or that like if we give funding to, you know, if we give funding to the women's movement, trans women can't be included. The predominance of like trans women who are not employed are in sex work says enough to us that there isn't an economic opportunity here, and that we must include all women if we're going to begin to change this system and these ways of operating. It doesn't, you know, patriarchy continues to flourish if cis women get taken in and the rest of us get left outside. That's not equitable. That's not changing the system. That's just sharing some of the spoils with some groups of people in order to allow them to live closer to the proverbial, you know, if there's a fire in a room, some people can stand close to the fire and some people must stand further away because they don't get to warm themselves.
If I may just add to what you also said around the inclusion of non-binary people being more palatable to feminist organizing, and particularly women's own organizing. One of the experiences that I had last year at the LBQ Feminist Women's Conference, the global conference of diverse women, into the space, of course, to discuss the politics surrounding the position of women within the world. And as part of the technical or the task team, I was quite shocked in terms of how trans exclusion was conceptualized, with a lot of fighting on the one end, disagreement and unhappiness, because when I asked the question around, so how are trans women included in this particular conference if we are only recognizing LBQ and not T for this particular conference? So the explanation that was given to me was trans women automatically are women, and that for me was progressive, but the way in which it was defined, that because this is a queer, bisexual, lesbian women's conference, that any trans woman that identifies as being heterosexual is excluded from this conference. And I found that dynamic to be quite interesting, and also important means to exclude the queerness that we also embody as trans women for being trans, because of the experiences that we have also lived through in our lives and that we embody in our lives. And for me, it just felt like a dismissal, a convenient dismissal of getting more trans women not to be included in this space.
But Liberty, like there was a lot of discussion on different sides. So for instance, I know some trans men wanted to go to the LBQ conference, and I'm like, it's fine, but are you lesbian, are you bi, are you queer, and are you a woman? Then those are the things that are the defining characteristics of this conference. Just like if we're going to say that we're going to have women's only spaces, and like if you are a trans man and you don't identify as a woman, that's not a space for you. I think it's fine to have LBQ spaces, and I think it's very forward thinking to say, well, it's not about cis women or trans women, it's about whether you're LBQ, because we know many trans women are not queer. I don't think it's actively, on the surface of it, I don't think it's actively exclusionary. It may well be a method, as you're suggesting, to exclude trans people in the kind of underpinnings of it and on an organizational basis. But I think having an LBQ conference that was for women but not really defining what a woman is was really revolutionary in a lot of senses.
I hear you, and just perhaps responding to that, because I think we're having two conversations in terms of that defining of womanness in relation to gender identity, and then of course on the basis that our sexuality. And if the intent of the conference was to have a queer women's conference on the basis of sexuality, then definitely. But on the other end, in terms of articulating understandings of queerness, then through that lens, need to be very clear. And I don't think that that was very clear from where I was situated within the conversation. And I think that when you say that many trans women do not identify as queer, you are correct in saying that, but at the same time, there are many trans women that also identifies as queer, but will not necessarily label themselves as being have a lesbian sexual orientation, bisexual sexual orientation, or queer sexual orientation. I think that that particular element of the conversation is much more complex than to perhaps just say that, and I'm not saying that you said that, because some people, the trans people, do not identify as queer, that by virtue of that, that should not be included within the space in itself.
I'm not saying, I don't think that I don't even know why I'm defending this. I'm not saying that, that there was, I think that we have to be careful that some spaces are going to be, as the minutiae of identities becomes more difficult to deal with, there are going to be some spaces that are created or exported. I mean, LBQ was not as far as I understand, a South African idea, right? And I met some trans men who were sent to LBQ from other countries, which I thought was, kind of a bit weird. Why are you here? This is a lesbian, bisexual, or queer women's conference. But, people must make their own choices. I agree with you. I think the thing that's also interesting about the LBQ conference is this use of the term queer. And, we know that, I know, and I had this conversation with Akani, some of you may know Akani Shimanga, about, I know some trans men who would call themselves trans men and lesbians at the same time. And they consider that to be, they're lesbians because they still consider themselves to be female body, but they feel that their gender identity is that of a man. So they would still go to an LBQ conference.
Thank you so much, B and Liberty. I just seeing that Patsy has had a hand up for a while now. I think maybe Patsy has a question. Patsy, would you like to ask your question?
Hi everyone. No, not really. A question, Zoe. If I could make an input, would that be okay?
Yes, please go for it.
Okay. Now, I can't really talk a lot about, feminist ideology and trans exclusion and so forth in terms of the theoretical sense and so forth. It's a lot of things that is happening. All I can submit to you guys is that is my own experience from the spaces that I work in, and I think some of you know the spaces that I work in besides the LGBTI space, the NGO and so forth. I'm also a government employee at a certain level. I'm also working in the political space. I'm a government spokesperson. I am an MEC spokesperson, which also gives me access to certain platforms, certain political platforms also. So, as a transgender person, I get to experience some of these things. And I think a lot of us are talking about promoting access and how we're excluded, but how we need to promote access to these platforms where decisions are made, where policies are being formulated and discussed and ironed out and so forth, and that we are excluded from these platforms. But the question later also becomes that even if we do have access to these platforms, how are we received? And our voices, even if we are there, if we talk about women in general, we can see that even though we've got things like 50-50 representation in government, for example, in leadership, for example, we do know that the authority and the weight that the voice of women carries is not the same than a man, for example. So I would find myself in these spaces. I would find myself engaging on certain issues and issues of the day. It doesn't matter: economic, social development, health, etc. but you would get your certain responses on these platforms where you are. And one of the first responses is a response of dismissal and a negation of what you are delivering, what you are submitting, because you would find, if I can do cross generalizations, for example, you would find that from your male cohort, they would dismiss or negate what you submit onto these platforms where you are on, because they dismiss and negate transgenderism or being transgender. They dismiss your gender identity. So by implication, whatever it is that comes out of your mouth or your hands or your efforts will also be negated, even though you are on these platforms. The responses I, for example, get from women politicians, women HODs, premiers, or whatever, on these spaces, is that you would also get the dismissal. It's like we are in a constant enhanced striving thing, that we are striving towards a womanhood that we would never really achieve, and that we only have a slight, we are being, it's like an honorary membership into the women's club, So it's that kind of dismissal also. And then by effect, then also it doesn't matter the quality and the usefulness of your input on these platforms that we are fighting to be on. um, it will be regarded in a specific way. And then what I have personally found, and I'm sharing, you guys can take what I'm sharing here and put it in the nice ways that you are communicating with each other. But what I get from women is that there is a real kind of competition. I'm being actively pushed out of the spaces of women's leadership spaces, because our voices are rising, and it's rising strong, and it's rising with power, and it has momentum, and women in leadership spaces are seeing my entry into these spaces as a kind of threat. And so I'm getting from women, for example, some serious walls that being built, and barricades that are being erected to prevent not even just my entry into the spaces, but also to even listen. It's, you can preach the best this gospel even to women in these spaces, but if your gender identity is negated or dismissed, number one. Secondly, if you are posing a threat in some way to the I don't know how to call it, the pool of what I'm doing, inverted commas right here, real women, then whatever it is that you are doing or saying are being ejected. So it is more than just fighting for access to spaces and platforms. It's like, it's when we are there, I'm asking, I need help, and we need help as trans women in these spaces on how to make our footprints and our efforts and our voices felt, so that it carries. Like I said, I made a connection with women in general that are now 50-50 in these spaces, but still the voice and the things that women want and the things that women demand are still at the sanction of a man, even in these spaces where we are supposed to be equal. So I'm just submitting my experience with this regard. I'm not sure how helpful it is, but I'm hoping it is. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you, Patsy. B or Liberty, would you like to respond to what Patsy has just said?
Do you want to take it, Liberty?
I just wanted to thank Patsy for
Yeah.
sharing that experience. And it's such an important experience to share, Patsy. And I know how difficult that space is to navigate that you are situated in at this moment. I'm just trying to think around the possibilities that could exist in how we also solidify solidarities as a community in order to push back and create more opportunities for awareness raising, for education, and of course enhancing people's understandings of the necessity also to see trans women as trans women, the different type of womanness that we embody within our community, that there's a necessity to have us at the strategic table or decision-making table. There's a necessity to have us within a higher level of decision-making. There's a necessity to not dismiss us, because the viewpoints that we contribute is so critical in order to push, and I take it within the South African context now, in order to push through a type of constitutional understanding of what this country has been envisioned to become in the future, in order to push liberation and dignity for all. And so for me, we need to try and see how we can promote the fact that trans women, trans people need to be part of the broader overarching decision-making spaces as part of equity and social justice within our country. If we don't do that and we continue to silence people and to marginalize people and to tokenistically use people in order to gain power for cisgender people, then that's violence in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely, Liberty. I think, you know, the problem, unfortunately, is well, one of the problems is that a lot of gender-based violence in this country is massive, but it's also systemic, right? So the exclusion and the violence that trans women feel, we need to understand more broadly as part of that system that says that anything other than cis men is simply not good enough, is not deserving of a seat at the table. And I think sadly, because of the levels of violence we see in our country, there is a kind of violence that happens in trying to exclude trans people by cis women in particular in certain situations who feel themselves under threat. And we see this echoed in very many different ways, you know, whether it's, you know, there are many older kind of, you know, cis women, lesbians in across our movements who are very angry at the existence and the ways in which trans men and some non-binary transmasculine people take up space, and they feel that those people should be excluded on the basis of their threat to particular things. So in all of this, you know, we have made change slowly over time, and unfortunately it is about just seeking out those like one or two allies. You know, I like to think every room has a Dr. Kaleng in it somewhere, and we just need to find her to begin to have those kind of allied conversations where a space at the table just needs someone next door to sit in the chair next door to you to say, yeah, I think this person also belongs here. However, and I mean, that puts so much pressure on us, but I don't see any other way.
Thank you, Brian Liberty. We have another hand from Olivia Nessa. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. You have your hand up. Please go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
Hello. No, it's Vanessa for short. I was just wondering about I'm still transitioning into female, so I'm still on hormones and stuff. I was just wondering about non-binary people in this context as well, like being seen or being how do you say, accepted on the platform, speak and stuff. And I was also just wondering, because the way, in my experience with people, I've noticed that they tend to, I don't want to like say something bad, but people tend to be only supportive in a way, in a sense of movements that that help themselves. Like, I don't know, I don't want to like sound like negative, but usually people form clubs like the golf club, women's only, ladies forbidden, or the rule of thumb and stuff like that, because it's like, I don't know, I don't want to say anything bad, but I mean, it's like the way people. So I was just wondering, is it possible for trans people to form their own sort of solidarity and how do you say, like their own club in a way. Maybe if that's a solution, I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Thank you, Vanessa. B, Liberty?
Do you want to go on this one?
Liberty, did you just ask me something you cut out?
I would say, do you want to go first at this one? And then I can
So I didn't hear the beginning part. Do you just want to repeat yourself?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, well, how do you think non-binary people fit into this context of being able to speak on these platforms? And as well, I was also just wondering, is it because I think that personally think that people are the way people are in the sense that they only really, that people in general don't care about the truth, they only care about what helps themselves. So I was wondering, in like maybe the light of that or whatever, is it possible for trans people to form their own groups, like, you know, golf, gentlemen's only, ladies forbidden, or something like that, but they only not in a pathological way, only in a way where they are able to actually make a stand, so to speak. If that's the only way I can see or think myself of any way of a solution, because yes, cisgender is basically the considered the, how do you say, ideal or whatever, but I'm not sure myself, honestly, how true this is, as a trans woman who's trying, you know, to be cis passing. But I was just wondering if it's possible for trans women to make their own stand, just, you know, to have respect or something, like, instead of maybe,
Sure.
I don't know, because of course we do make our stand, but I mean, the thing is, people don't usually accept people into their groups and stuff because of the way people are. So I was just wondering, you know, if it makes sense. I hope the
Yeah, I mean that makes something that you know, passing in the world is completely acceptable. Cis people are able to pass. Cis people do not define passing. We need to stop giving cisness a power as though that is something we want to be or ascribe to. We might see the possibilities of our own gender identity through that, but there's ways in which we talk about cisness as empowering systems, which I think is one of the issues that keeps to be trans is just as good as being, which is I don't for clubs mobilizing. I very deeply believe that there is a place for non-binary people in feminism. I'm a feminist, and the only way
B, I think we are losing you with the audio.
Through my feminism. But feminism is not a religion. It's something that's malleable. It's a perception and a belief that the world should be a better place, and that gender equity is needed across all kinds of gender. It's a model of understanding gender that isn't binary based.
Okay, I think we've lost B.
Yeah. And if I can just perhaps, I got snippets of what B said. I didn't get everything, Zoe. But in looking at the ask around the place of non-binary people within the bigger context, and B addressed that from a feminist vantage point, to say that it is to be inclusive, because feminism is malleable, it's not a religion, and of course, therefore, it's flexible to different gender identities and expressions that from my vantage point, particularly from a marginalized vantage point, would be included within the realm of what feminism tries to achieve through its political intent and its socioeconomic intent. I think in perhaps bringing it back a little bit to the trans community, oftentimes what I find is that there's a huge question mark at the moment in terms of how during our organizing, during the scope of our organizing, gender diverse persons locate themselves within the ambit of our politics. And one of the recurring themes that have often come up is specifically the place of gender non-conforming expressive persons, that they also seeks refuge and of course, the possibilities of feeling safe and feeling enabled for the change that they want to promote in the world within trans and gender diverse spaces. I think we need to have broader conversations around what that looks like currently. And it cannot, of course, be a blanket approach that needs to be taken. It needs to be very much context specific in terms of what organizing looks like and what is at stake and what people understand the politic to be, and then be able to see what possibilities exist at this time to ensure that we don't leave any of our siblings behind when we are trying to push for a more gender equitable world for all of us to live in as trans and gender diverse persons. So I just find that to be quite fascinating based on your question, that there is no clear answer in terms of where we're situated on that, and that we probably have to have many more discussions to create more spaces for gender, for non-binary people to also feel safe within our organizing spaces.
Liberty, thank you so much. We are sitting at 3 o'clock, so we are very much out of time, and I see just another 2 hands have been raised. So I think was it Patsy and Catherine that I'm seeing that have hands raised? If you want to just take 30 seconds at the very most just to make your comment or your question very quickly, please, because we do need to end. We're at 3:01. Over to Patsy very quickly.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, just very quickly, what I'm going to do is just, like I said, we talk about access to platforms and so forth, and exclusion of trans people and so forth. But I think going forward, we need to actively think about what will happen and when we do access these spaces and these platforms, how are we strategically going to approach these spaces and these platforms? What kind of affirming and supportive care and support can we give each other when we reach these spaces? When gender dynamics is using the word amplifying, and amplifying for me, it's not just, make louder, but it's also for me a successive kind of synergistic thing where each one of us, we take part, we take that voice, and each one of us, by becoming that voice too, of Liberty, of Zoe, of Jabu, of whoever is speaking, we are amplifying that voice by affirming it and by carrying it further. But we need to think about, because we are moving into what spaces where we are going to get access to platforms and so forth, but strategically and practically, what are we going to do when we are in those spaces? That's what I need us to think about. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you, Patsy. Catherine, some closing words from you.
Hi, sorry, thank you so much for the space. I don't really have closing remarks, but I wanted to understand from the organizers, Gender Dynamics and Iranti, in your subject, a feminist approach to trans exclusion, what you can leave us with in terms of pushing back against trans exclusion, as we're seeing a rise of the rights and the anti-gender movement, which is fundamentally very turfy. Just wanted to understand what you meant by a feminist approach to trans exclusion. Is it a way of calling these folks in through advocacy and popular education, and just referencing Jabu's question around, is it our responsibility to shift, and is it possible to shift trans exclusion and its root in patriarchy? Yeah, I just wanted some thoughts from our comrades on how we challenge trans exclusion.
Liberty, would you like to take that last question? I think it might be a nice rounding off to the session to bring it back to the topic that we're discussing.
Certainly, Zoe. I think in terms of looking at how we can create equity at the table in having the conversation around an inclusive feminism, and of course also beyond feminism through the work that feminism can do within other strategic spaces, we need to look at how we can also equitably support and empower trans organizing and trans organizations and communities to be able to optimally participate within these conversations and within these spaces that we need to create. I certainly don't think that we need to labor alone as trans and gender diverse persons to fight for our inclusion. And again, playing on the idea of depending on allies, both within feminism as it stands at the moment, to be able to provide and create spaces with us for us to dialogue and converse towards optimal solutions. And sometimes that does come in the form of having to disrupt the status quo in order to get the point across that we cannot continue on the current trajectory, which is going to result in us being erased and invisibilized within the ambit of the women's rights movement, for example, as well. So in looking at the principles that we are trying to speak to promote a more inclusive approach in feminism, it's really around looking at respecting different marginalized communities through a gendered lens, and we address that through from a trans woman perspective. We spoke about that from a gender diverse perspective, and of course in some instances we note that self-determination plays a pivotal role in how people define who they are, who we are, and how we see ourselves in relation to getting access to spaces. So it needs to be a flexible conversation that we also need to have in order to hold the dignity of diverse persons within the community. It also informs then the level of dignity that we are able to experience within the spaces when we do take on somewhat of an accountability for the type of trauma and the pain and the hurt that we inflict onto one another within these spaces. I think that one of the lessons learned last year for me has been we don't have those mechanisms in place at the moment in terms of how to deal with trans hurt, insult, pain, and humiliation within spaces. And that is something that we need to journey with each other towards if we do have an interest in challenging patriarchy in all its forms in the world. And then, of course, touched on solidarity cannot underscore the importance of having to push forward in solidarity, because that is in essence the only way in which we are going to dismantle patriarchy and all its sub-functions, cis-normativity as a sub-function of patriarchy, to be able to ensure that there's more possibility for liberation for all of us.
And on that note, thank you so much, Liberty. B does send their apologies. They can't seem to be rejoin the meeting. I just want to say thank you so much to Liberty Matesa and to B Kaminga for joining us as panelists today for this really in-depth and robust discussion today. Really, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who joined us for this session today. We are 7 minutes over time already, so thank you for bearing with us. Again, the recording of this session will be made available later on in the week on the Gender Dynamics website. So if you want to go and revisit the conversation or share that with your peers or your colleagues or your friends, you can go and find that on the GDX website. Again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to the panelists, and we hope to see you all next time for the online conversations. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Zoe.
Bye, thanks.